I walked into my house and police said, "We found 3 bodies in your basement." Detective Lawrence Brennan stood in my living room with 4 other officers, all of them watching me as I set down my overnight bag and stared back in complete confusion. I'm Nathan Cross, a high school history teacher who'd just driven back from a weekend camping trip in the Adirondacks. My house was in a quiet neighborhood in Westfield, a suburb where the most exciting thing that usually happened was someone forgetting to bring their trash cans in on collection day. 3 bodies in my basement made no sense whatsoever. "I'm sorry. What did you just say?" I managed to get out, my mouth suddenly dry. Detective Brennan stepped forward, his badge visible on his belt. "We received an anonymous tip this morning about suspicious activity at this address. We obtained a search warrant and discovered 3 deceased individuals in your basement. You're going to need to come with us for questioning." I felt the room tilt. My basement was unfinished, just concrete floors and exposed beams where I stored camping equipment and old furniture. I'd been gone since Friday afternoon and hadn't been down there in over a week before that. "That's impossible. I don't even go in my basement except to grab storage boxes. I've been camping since Friday. I have receipts, photos. My friend Aaron was with me the whole weekend. We were at Faro Lake." One of the officers moved behind me, positioning himself near the door. Detective Brennan's expression remained neutral, but I could see he wasn't interested in my camping trip. "Mr. Cross, I need you to understand the seriousness of this situation. We found 3 bodies buried in shallow graves in your basement floor. The concrete had been broken up, bodies placed underneath, then covered with fresh concrete. This required significant time and effort. You need to come with us now." The concrete in my basement was original, poured when the house was built in 1987. I'd bought the place 3 years ago and never touched the basement floor. It was cracked in places but solid. Someone would have needed jackhammers and concrete mixing equipment to do what he was describing. "I want to see them," I said, my voice shaking. "I want to see my basement right now." Detective Brennan shook his head. "That's not possible. This is an active crime scene. Forensic teams are processing evidence. You're not going anywhere near that basement. We need you to come to the station voluntarily, or we can arrest you right now. Your choice." I knew enough about legal rights to understand I needed a lawyer immediately, but part of me thought if I cooperated, if I showed them I had nothing to hide, this nightmare would resolve itself quickly. "I'll come voluntarily, but I'm calling my lawyer from the station." They didn't handcuff me, but I rode in the back of a police car, while another officer drove my vehicle to the station. At the precinct, they put me in an interrogation room and told me to wait. I called Jerome Hastings, a criminal defense attorney my ex-wife had used during her DUI case 2 years ago. Jerome answered on the 3rd ring, and I explained the situation as calmly as I could manage. "Don't say anything to anyone until I get there," Jerome said immediately. "Not a word. They're going to try to get you talking, act friendly, suggest that cooperating will help you. Don't fall for it. I'll be there in 30 minutes. I sat in that room for almost an hour before Jerome arrived with his assistant, a younger lawyer named Claire Donovan. They'd already been briefed by the police about what had been found. Jerome was in his 50s, heavy-set with graying hair and the permanent squint of someone who'd read too many legal documents. He sat across from me while Claire took notes. "They're claiming 3 bodies were found in your basement buried under fresh concrete. The medical examiner is on scene now. They haven't identified the victims yet, but preliminary observations suggest the bodies are recent, possibly within the last 2 weeks. Do you know anything about this?" I told them about my camping trip, about being gone since Friday, about the basement being original concrete I'd never modified. Jerome listened without interrupting, and then asked the crucial question. "Have you had any work done on your house recently? Any contractors? Any renovations? Anyone with access to your basement?" I thought back over the past month. "My furnace broke 3 weeks ago. I had a heating repair company come out to fix it. They went into the basement to access the furnace, but that was it." Jerome made notes. "I need the name of that company and the exact dates they were there. I also need a list of everyone who has keys to your house, anyone who might have had access while you were away. This is clearly a setup, but we need to figure out who had means and opportunity." I provided the heating company's name, Thompson Mechanical Services, and explained that my cleaning service also had a key, though they only came on Wednesdays and hadn't been scheduled while I was camping. My neighbor, An older woman named Ruth Winters had a spare key for emergencies, but she'd lived next door for 20 years and had arthritis in both hands. The idea of her breaking up concrete and burying bodies was absurd. Jerome sent Claire to start investigating the heating company while he stayed with me for the police interrogation. Detective Brennan came in with his partner, Detective Angela Foster. They had a thick file folder and recording equipment. After the formalities of recording names and times, Brennan started with softball questions about my background, my job, my routine. Then he shifted. "Mr. Cross, when was the last time you were in your basement?" I looked at Jerome, who nodded slightly. "About 10 days ago, maybe 12. I went down to grab a folding chair for a cookout I was having." Detective Foster jumped in. "During that cookout, did you have many people over? Anyone go into your basement?" I explained it had been just 3 colleagues from school. We'd stayed in the backyard. Nobody went inside except to use the bathroom. She wrote something in her notepad. "What about the heating repair? Walk us through exactly what happened." I described calling Thompson Mechanical after my furnace died, how they'd sent a technician named Paul something. I couldn't remember his last name. He'd spent about 3 hours in the basement fixing the furnace, charged me $800 and left. I'd paid by credit card and had a receipt somewhere in my email. Detective Brennan pulled a photo from his folder and slid it across the table. It showed my basement floor with a section of concrete that looked newer than the surrounding area, roughly 6 feet by 8 feet. The fresh concrete was obvious against the cracked, stained original floor. "That's not how my basement looked 10 days ago," I said immediately. "That concrete is new. Someone did this while I was camping this weekend." Detective Foster leaned forward. "Mr. Cross, breaking up concrete, digging graves, placing bodies, mixing and pouring new concrete, that's at least 2 days of work, probably more. You're saying someone broke into your house, did all this work and you had no idea?" I felt panic rising, but Jerome's hand on my arm steadied me. "My client is saying exactly that. He has a solid alibi for the past 3 days and evidence that his basement floor was intact before he left. Someone clearly framed him, which means you should be investigating who had access to his property, not wasting time interrogating a victim." Detective Brennan's expression hardened. "A victim? We have 3 dead bodies in his basement. Until we know who they are and how they got there, Mr. Cross is a suspect, not a victim." The interrogation continued for another 2 hours, circling through the same questions in different forms. They wanted to know about my relationships, any conflicts with neighbors, whether I'd had romantic partners recently. I'd been divorced for 3 years and hadn't dated seriously since. They asked about my students, whether any parents had complaints against me. I taught 11th grade American history and generally got along well with students and parents. The only recent issue had been with a parent named Douglas Whitmore, whose son Kevin had failed my class last semester. Douglas had threatened to file a complaint with the school board, claiming I'd failed Kevin out of personal bias. The complaint had been dismissed after the principal reviewed Kevin's test scores and attendance records, showing he'd earned the failing grade legitimately. Jerome perked up at that. "This Douglas Whitmore, did he make any direct threats against you?" I recalled the conversation in the school parking lot where Douglas had gotten in my face, yelling that I'd destroyed his son's college prospects and I'd regret it. At the time, I'd dismissed it as an angry parent blowing off steam. But now I wondered if it was relevant. I shared this with the detectives and Jerome made detailed notes. Detective Foster asked for Douglas Whitmore's contact information and wrote it down, though her expression suggested she didn't think an angry parent would go to the extreme of planting bodies in someone's basement. The interrogation ended with them telling me not to leave town and that I could go home once forensics finished processing the scene, probably sometime the next day. Jerome drove me to a hotel that night since I couldn't access my house. In his car, he was blunt about the situation. "They're going to identify those bodies probably within 24 hours. If any of them have any connection to you whatsoever, even tangential, you're going to be arrested. We need to get ahead of this. I'm hiring a private investigator to look into Thompson Mechanical and anyone else who had access to your house. Claire is pulling property records to see if there's any history we should know about. You need to document everything about your camping trip, every receipt, every photo, every moment you can account for." I spent that night in a Holiday Inn, unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand who would do this to me and why. The news broke the next morning. 3 bodies discovered in Westfield home, read the local news headline. My name wasn't mentioned yet, but my address was, and it wouldn't take long for people to connect the dots. My phone started ringing with calls from colleagues, from the school administration, from former students. I didn't answer any of them. Jerome called at 9 a.m. with an update. The bodies had been identified. 2 women and 1 man, all in their early 20s, all reported missing within the past 6 weeks from towns within 50 miles of Westfield. Their names were Christina Valdez, Rebecca Shore, and Marcus Flynn. I didn't recognize any of those names. I'd never met these people, had no connection to them, no reason they'd be in my house, let alone buried in my basement. Jerome had already started researching the victims. Christina Valdez had been a nursing student who'd disappeared 3 weeks ago after leaving her shift at a hospital in Albany. Rebecca Shore had been reported missing 5 weeks ago, a graphic designer who'd last been seen leaving a coffee shop in Saratoga Springs. Marcus Flynn had vanished 6 weeks ago, a grad student at SUNY Albany studying environmental science. None of them had any apparent connection to each other or to me. The police were holding a press conference that afternoon, and Jerome wanted me nowhere near it. "They're going to paint you as a serial killer," he said bluntly. 3 young people, all disappeared over a 6-week period, all found in one location. The media will run wild with this. Stay off social media, don't read comments, don't engage with anyone. The press conference was worse than Jerome predicted. Detective Brennan stood at a podium and announced they were investigating the deaths as homicides, that a person of interest was cooperating with the investigation, and that they believed they had the situation contained with no ongoing threat to public safety. The implication was clear to anyone watching. They thought I'd killed these 3 people, and I was the person of interest. My photo appeared on news sites within the hour, pulled from my school's faculty webpage, comment sections filled with speculation and condemnation. "Lock him up forever," and "death penalty for this monster" appeared alongside my face. Students I'd taught posted confused messages asking if the Mr. Cross they knew could really be a murderer. Some defended me, others said they'd always thought there was something off about me. The school board held an emergency meeting that evening and suspended me with pay pending the outcome of the investigation. The principal, Thomas Greer, called me personally to deliver the news. "Nathan, I have to do this. You understand, right? Parents are calling in panic. We can't have you in a classroom while this is hanging over you." I understood, but it still felt like another piece of my life crumbling away. Jerome's investigator, a woman named Simone Garrett, called that night with preliminary findings on Thompson Mechanical Services. The company had been in business for 8 years with generally good reviews, but had 3 complaints filed in the past year about overcharging and unnecessary repairs. The technician who'd worked on my furnace was named Paul Derrick, 31 years old, with a clean criminal record and no red flags in his background. Simone had interviewed Paul that afternoon, showing up at his house and asking about the furnace repair at my address. Paul remembered the job and confirmed he'd spent about 3 hours in my basement. He'd noticed the concrete was cracked, but hadn't seen any signs of recent work or disturbance. He'd taken photos of the furnace as part of his standard documentation, and those photos showed the basement floor in the background. Simone had gotten copies and sent them to Jerome. The photos clearly showed the original cracked concrete with no signs of the fresh patch where the bodies had been found. This proved the work had been done after Paul's visit, narrowing the timeline. Someone had broken up my basement floor, buried 3 bodies, and poured concrete all within a 3-week window between the furnace repair and my camping trip. But that timeline created a problem. If the work had been done over the past 3 weeks and I was home most nights, how had I not heard jackhammers and concrete mixing in my basement? Jerome raised this question when we met the next day. I explained that I'd been at school during the day, getting home around 4 p.m. most days. I'd had after-school meetings twice a week that kept me late until 6 or 7. On weekends, I'd been running errands, going to the gym, generally out of the house for several hours at a time. Someone could have watched my patterns and timed the work for when I was gone, but it would still require multiple trips into my house, heavy equipment, and taking a massive risk that I wouldn't come home unexpectedly. It seemed nearly impossible unless someone had extensive knowledge of my schedule and access to my house. Claire Donovan had been researching property records and found something interesting. My house had belonged to a family named the Castellanos before I bought it. They'd lived there for 15 years before selling 3 years ago. The father, Victor Castellano, had died in the house from a heart attack, which had been disclosed during my purchase. What hadn't been disclosed was that Victor's death had occurred under suspicious circumstances. He'd been found in the basement, and although the medical examiner ruled it natural causes, there had been some questions about bruising on his body that were never fully explained. His widow, Gloria Castellano, had sold the house quickly after his death and moved to Florida. Their adult children had contested the sale, claiming Gloria had undervalued the property, but the lawsuit had been dismissed. Jerome wanted to know if there was any connection between the Castellano family and the 3 victims. Simone started digging into that angle while Claire focused on finding any link between Cristina Valdez, Rebecca Shore, and Marcus Flynn. There had to be something connecting them, some reason they'd been chosen as victims. By the end of the second day, Claire had found it. All 3 victims had been adopted as children. Cristina had been adopted from foster care at age 7. Rebecca had been adopted from Guatemala at age 3. Marcus had been adopted from the Philippines at age 5. They'd all gone to support groups for adopted adults, trying to find their biological families. They'd all used the same adoption search service, a nonprofit called Roots Reconnected, based in Albany. This was the first real break in understanding why these specific people had been targeted. Jerome immediately got in touch with Roots Reconnected, and they were cooperative, but cautious. The director, a woman named Helen Portman, explained that they helped adopted adults navigate the search process for biological family members. They had about 200 active clients at any given time. Cristina, Rebecca, and Marcus had all been clients within the past year. Helen was devastated to learn they'd been murdered and wanted to help however possible, but she couldn't see any reason their adoption searches would lead to them being killed. Simone asked for a list of all staff members who would have had access to client files. Helen provided names and contact information for 8 employees, all of whom had been with the organization for years with clean backgrounds. The police had made this same connection and were interviewing Roots Reconnected staff. Detective Brennan held another press conference, announcing they were investigating whether the victims had been targeted because of their connection to the adoption search service. He still didn't rule me out as a suspect, but the focus was broadening. Local news stations ran stories about the victims, interviewing their families and friends. Christina's adoptive mother appeared on camera crying, saying her daughter had been beautiful and kind, studying to be a pediatric nurse. Rebecca's adoptive father spoke about his daughter's talent as an artist and her desire to meet her biological family in Guatemala. Marcus's adoptive parents released a statement describing their son's passion for environmental conservation and his hopes of finding his biological siblings. While the public mourned, Jerome and Simone kept digging. Simone discovered that Douglas Whitmore, the angry parent whose son had failed my class, had a brother named Leonard Whitmore who'd worked in construction for 20 years. Leonard had access to concrete equipment and knew how to do the kind of work that had been done in my basement. Simone interviewed neighbors near Leonard's workshop and learned he'd been seen loading concrete mixing equipment onto a trailer 3 weeks ago, which matched our timeline. When Simone confronted Leonard, he admitted he'd done some concrete work recently but claimed it was for a legitimate customer. He refused to provide details without talking to a lawyer, which raised red flags. Simone brought this information to Detective Brennan, who seemed interested but non-committal. The forensic analysis of my basement came back with more revelations. The fresh concrete had been mixed with a specific brand of quick-dry cement sold at a limited number of suppliers in the region. Police traced purchases and found that Leonard Whitmore had bought 300 pounds of that exact cement brand 2.5 weeks ago, paying cash. When questioned, Leonard claimed he'd used it for a driveway repair job, but couldn't provide the customer's name or contact information. The story was falling apart, and police started focusing more seriously on Leonard as a suspect. But that raised the question of why Leonard would murder 3 random people he had no connection to just to frame me for failing his nephew. It seemed like a massive overreaction, even for someone with a grudge. Simone kept investigating Leonard's background and discovered he'd had financial troubles recently. His construction business was failing, He'd missed mortgage payments, and he'd been sued twice by clients for incomplete work. 3 months ago, he'd suddenly paid off $50,000 in debts. Bank records showed the money had come from a wire transfer from an offshore account that couldn't be traced. Someone had paid Leonard to do something, and the timing aligned with when the victims had started disappearing. If Leonard had been hired to kill these 3 people and frame me, that meant someone else was orchestrating this whole thing. But who and why me specifically? I'd lived a quiet life, taught history, didn't have enemies beyond Douglas Whitmore's complaints about his son's grade. Claire Donovan made the breakthrough while researching the Castellano family history. Victor Castellano, who'd died in my basement, had a younger brother named Ramon Castellano, who'd served 15 years in prison for kidnapping and assault. Ramon had been released on parole 3 years ago, right around when I bought the house from Gloria Castellano. Prison records showed Ramon had been angry about the property sale, claiming the house should have stayed in the family and that Gloria had stolen his inheritance. He'd threatened to get the house back somehow. But Ramon Castellano had died 8 months ago from liver cancer in a hospice facility in Buffalo. He couldn't be the one orchestrating this. However, Ramon had a son named Victor Jr., named after his deceased uncle. Victor Jr. was 28 years old, worked as an IT contractor, and had no criminal record. Simone tracked down Victor Jr. and found he'd been living in Albany, close to where all 3 victims had gone missing. His social media profiles showed an obsession with his family's history and resentment about losing the family home. Posts from 2 years ago complained about strangers living in his uncle's house, defiling the property where his uncle had died. Posts from a year ago mentioned justice and retribution in vague terms. 3 months ago, right when Leonard Whitmore had received that mysterious $50,000 payment, Victor Jr. had posted about plans finally coming together and making things right. Simone brought all of this to Jerome, who immediately took it to Detective Brennan. Finally, the detective seemed to take the frame-up theory seriously. Police executed a search warrant on Victor Jr.'s apartment and found a laptop with searches for adoption search services. Information about Christina Valdez, Rebecca Shore, and Marcus Flynn, and floor plans for my house. They also found receipts for rental of concrete equipment and communications with Leonard Whitmore discussing the job without specific details. Most damning, they found photographs of all 3 victims taken before they were killed, along with notes about their schedules and routines. Victor Jr. was arrested at his workplace and brought in for questioning. Initially, he denied everything, but when confronted with the evidence from his laptop, he asked for a lawyer and stopped talking. Leonard Whitmore was arrested the same day for conspiracy to commit murder and accessory to murder. The prosecutor's office held a press conference announcing the arrests and clearing me of suspicion. I wasn't charged, wasn't considered a person of interest any longer. The media coverage shifted immediately. Teacher framed in elaborate murder plot became the new headline. Reporters wanted to interview me about my ordeal, but Jerome advised against it. The criminal cases against Victor Jr. and Leonard Whitmore would take time to build, and anything I said publicly could complicate prosecution. I issued a brief statement through Jerome thanking the investigators who'd uncovered the truth and expressing condolences to the families of the victims. That was it. No dramatic press conference, no tearful interview. I just wanted to rebuild my life. But rebuilding proved harder than I expected. The school board reinstated me, but parents had complained enough that the principal suggested I might be happier at a different school. Students looked at me differently, some with sympathy, some with lingering suspicion. 3 bodies had been found in my basement, and even though I'd been cleared, the association remained. I requested a transfer to a different school in the district, and it was granted. I started fresh at Riverside High that fall, teaching the same American history curriculum to students who didn't know my story. Some found out eventually through internet searches, but most just knew me as their teacher, not the guy from the news. The criminal trial for Victor Jr. and Leonard Whitmore started 18 months after that terrible day when I'd walked into my house to find police in my living room. The prosecution laid out a meticulous case showing how Victor Jr. had become obsessed with reclaiming his family's house and had developed an elaborate plan to force me out. He'd researched my background and discovered the incident with Douglas Whitmore's son. He'd approached Leonard Whitmore with a proposal. Leonard would kill 3 random people, bury them in my basement while I was away, and make it look like I was a serial killer. In exchange, Leonard would receive $50,000 from an offshore account Victor Jr. had set up using his IT skills and cryptocurrency investments. Once I was convicted and imprisoned, Victor Jr. planned to buy the house at a reduced price during the legal proceedings and reclaim what he saw as his family's property. The randomness of the victims had been intentional. Victor Jr. had specifically chosen adopted adults searching for their biological families because their searches created a paper trail he could exploit. He'd hacked into Roots Reconnected's database and selected 3 clients who had limited family connections and whose disappearances might not be immediately investigated. He'd stalked them, learned their routines, and helped Leonard abduct them. The murders had been carried out in a rented warehouse Leonard controlled. Then the bodies had been transported to my house during times when Victor Jr. had confirmed I was away. Leonard had used his construction expertise to break up my basement floor, bury the bodies, and repour concrete, working quickly over a single weekend when I'd been visiting my sister in Boston 3 weeks before my camping trip. The prosecution called me to testify about discovering the crime scene, about my relationship with the house, about never having met Victor Jr. or having any connection to his family. I spent 2 days on the stand describing my ordeal, the interrogations, the suspension from work, the public accusations. The defense tried to suggest I'd somehow been involved, that maybe I'd worked with Victor Jr., but Jerome had prepared me well. I remained calm, stuck to facts, and the jury could see I was a victim, not a perpetrator. Cristina Valdez's adoptive mother testified about her daughter's dreams, her kindness, her senseless murder. Rebecca Shore's adoptive father showed the jury his daughter's artwork, explaining how her talent had been stolen from the world. Marcus Flynn's adoptive parents described their son's passion for the environment and his unfinished research. The jury deliberated for 8 hours before returning guilty verdicts against both defendants on all major charges. Victor Jr. was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy, kidnapping, and fraud. Leonard Whitmore was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy, and accessory to murder. The judge scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later. At sentencing, the courtroom was packed with family members of the victims, media, and people who'd followed the case. The judge heard impact statements from each family. Christina's mother could barely speak through tears, describing the hole her daughter's death had left in their lives. Rebecca's father read a prepared statement about his daughter's unrealized potential. Marcus's parents stood together and spoke about their son's dedication to making the world better, a mission cut short by senseless violence. The judge addressed Victor Jr. directly before sentencing. You murdered 3 innocent people in pursuit of a property you had no legal claim to. You destroyed families, traumatized a community, and attempted to destroy an innocent man's life to satisfy your obsession with a house. Your crimes demonstrate a profound lack of empathy and a dangerous disregard for human life. He sentenced Victor Jr. to life in prison without possibility of parole for each murder count, to be served consecutively, plus 25 years for conspiracy and other charges. Leonard Whitmore received the same sentence for his role in the murders. Both men would die in prison, which seemed like the only appropriate outcome for such calculated cruelty. The civil lawsuits came next. The families of Cristina Valdez, Rebecca Shore, and Marcus Flynn sued Victor Jr.'s estate and Leonard Whitmore for wrongful death. I wasn't named in those suits, but I filed my own lawsuit against both men for damages to my property, emotional distress, and defamation. My homeowner's insurance had covered the cost of removing and replacing the contaminated concrete in my basement, but the psychological damage couldn't be quantified in dollars. I settled for a modest amount that would never come close to compensation for what I'd endured, but at least represented acknowledgement of harm. The victims' families received larger settlements, though nothing could replace their loved ones. I sold the house 18 months after the trial ended. I couldn't live there anymore, couldn't walk through that door without remembering police officers in my living room telling me about bodies in my basement. I bought a condo across town, smaller and newer, with no history and no basement. I continued teaching at Riverside High, and most students didn't know my background. I dated occasionally but found it hard to trust people after being framed so elaborately. I went to therapy to work through the trauma of being falsely accused. of seeing my name associated with murder, of having my entire life upended by someone else's obsession. 5 years after walking into my house to find my life destroyed, I attended a memorial service organized by Roots Reconnected for Christina, Rebecca, and Marcus. The organization had created a scholarship fund in their names to help other adopted adults search for biological families safely. I donated to the fund and met some of their family members, who thanked me for cooperating with the investigation and for speaking out about how the justice system had initially failed all of us by focusing on the obvious suspect instead of digging deeper. Helen Portman, the director, told me the organization had completely overhauled their security protocols to prevent future database hacks. It was small comfort, but at least some good had come from the tragedy. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.